This video is about whole signs astrology and the ruler of the ascendant. So I'm going to speak first about what whole signs astrology is, and then I'm going to explain how important it is to know the ruler of your ascendant and what house that ruler is operating in. And this is very much an ancient perspective on astrology, is the ruler of your ascendant steers your life. So whatever that planet is, whatever sign it's in, whatever house it's in, and what we call its condition, that is the steersman or the steerswoman of your entire life. So it's very important to know what your ascendant is and what planet rules that ascendant. Now we're going to be doing traditional astrology and whole signs, which means that we use the traditional rulers of the signs. So there are planets being discovered every day, asteroids being discovered every day, and we do not ascribe, for instance, Uranus to be the ruler of Aquarius. We do the traditional ruler of Aquarius, which is Saturn. So in a way, we're coming back to what is the ancient astrology. And in whole signs, which I'm going to explain to you right now, we see that the whole sign was rising on the eastern horizon at the time when you took your first breath. That gives you a whole sign of 30 degrees of one singular sign, and the ascendant somewhere in there between 0 and 2959 degrees. So let's just get an image on how an astrologer, particularly an ancient astrologer, would have seen this rising sign. So in ancient times, there was an hourly watcher called the horoscope, and he was or she was watching the sky to see what sign was rising. Say that at the moment of your birth, half of the sign, let's call it Scorpio, was in the eastern horizon, and half of that sign was still below the horizon. So that we would say the ascendant was at, say, 15 degrees, because in whole signs, half of that sign had come up above the horizon. Do you see how that would work? So if we were to use a more modern approach, the ascendant would just be the first line in the chart. And even if it were 19 degrees Scorpio, it would be the first line. And any planets that were on before that in, say, 0 to 19 degrees Scorpio fall into the 12th house. Now that's a very different system than whole signs. And what I would like everyone to approach is restoring some of these more ancient techniques, because if you look at astrology programs, there are hundreds of ways to interpret a chart. I would like you to always default to whole signs when choosing a what's called house system. Okay, so I have a chart drawn, and we're going to hold this up. So Lindsay and I will show you some charts. And in this, I've just folded over the top so you can see the full chart. Here's the ascendant. It's at 18 degrees. That means that part of Cancer, the sign that is rising, is still below the horizon. So imagine yourself an ancient watcher of the horizon. Part of the ascendant is below the horizon, but much of the ascendant is above the horizon. And on this day, which this is a chart that I just made up, and I'll tell you how I made it up later in this video. In this chart, it's very important that if it's 18 degrees, the Sun, Jupiter, and Venus are all within that first 18 degrees. So Venus is at 2 degrees, Jupiter's at 5 degrees, the Sun is at 15 degrees, the ascendant is at 18 degrees. So at the moment of birth, the first house ascendant is at 18 degrees. Now, in other house systems, the ascendant would be here at the horizon line. And that would throw Sun, Jupiter, and Venus into the 12th house. The Sun, Jupiter, and Venus in the 12th house, the two benefics and the main luminary of the life, would be in a house of self-undoing, a house of hidden, a house in which suffering had to be transcended through a spiritual life. That's quite a different chart than having the ascendant somewhere in the first house and having the two benefics and the luminary, the sun, in the first house. Can you see the difference there? Okay, so if I were to say, oh, the ascendant just begins here, and those three planets, which are very important planets, are thrown into the house that is hidden, meaning that you can't really access your Venus, you can't really access your Jupiter. It's much harder to access your sun or your soul's purpose. There's a certain amount of self-undoing or imprisonment. I kind of call this the house of the psyche. All things that are hidden, kind of like having a life of a vision quest where you have to spend a lot of time alone. Okay, so then you would have those planets there, and it not only would shift that, it would shift all the other planets to another house, so that the reading of the chart is quite difficult. So for this series of videos, I'm going to ask that you always use the whole signs house system. And if you're already practicing astrology, just try it. Try the whole signs house system. Now, the next piece that I'm going to talk about is the ruler of this ascendant. So we will be studying the signs. This is Cancer. The ruler of Cancer is the moon. And so what we would immediately look for is, well, where is the moon? Where is the ruler of the ascendant acting in this person's life? In this person's life, the moon is in the 8th house, Aquarius. And then I'm going to give you a little bit more today on the conditions of how does the moon feel in the 8th house. Is it a day chart or a night chart? Is the moon aspected by malefics? What are the parts of the 8th house that the moon will be exploring, such as death, dimensions, what one astrologer calls border crossing, meaning border from this life to the next life, or the place of the dimensions where other beings are unseen, magical realms, other worlds. And modern astrologers are using this also as other people's money. So they call it the house of inheritance or debt. But in my view, if there were no money on the planet, it would be about those border crossings between this life and the next. So in this person's chart, the ruler of the ascendant is the moon, and the activity is this death, dimensions, other world, magical realms, and possibly other people's money, as long as there is money on the planet. Now, the next piece of that is the moon, being a very quick moving planet, is something that's affecting you every day. So let's just take this down, Lindsay. So the moon, and I know Lindsay has a Cancer ascendant, so I chose this because she would be able to talk about this a little bit. So the moon then is changing every 2.5 days. So then the ruler of the ascendant is a very changeable, it's not a planet, it's a satellite, but a very changeable object, something that suddenly goes from Sagittarius to Capricorn, and then the feeling is completely different, and suddenly it's in Aquarius. So the ruler of the ascendant, the steersman of the ship of life, is always changing. So day to day, the person feels something very different suddenly every day. Whereas if you had a planet that moved slower, say that Saturn were the ruler of the ascendant, you would be more stable, more steadfast. Okay, you climb the ladder slower or move down the ladder slower. So we're going to talk about all of those things. Whereas, let's just use another example of Mars. Mars, if Mars was the ruler of the ascendant, it'd be very passionate and fiery and moving fast. And we're going to give you some archetypes of what each of these planets represent also, so you know kind of the steersman of your ship and the archetype of that steersman. So the next thing I want to talk about is how vital and important the ascendant is, so the degree of the ascendant. It's considered the most sensitive, vital part of the entire chart. So it is far more important than your sun, your moon, or any other planet in the chart. The point of the ascendant is something that we really want to watch. So for instance, say that you have an ascendant and Venus has just retrograded over the ascendant, which happened to me recently. On that day, events would happen that correspond to the archetype of what Venus retrograde is. So Venus retrograde is losing all her powers, going into the underworld, being accused, found guilty, given the evil eye, and left for dead. So we're just still finishing the Venus retrograde period right now, which has caused Lindsay and I to change tremendously. So the moment that Venus retrograde hits that ascendant, there's likely to be something happen in the life of the person whose chart has that point, which is called the native of the chart. Something very potent within the archetype of Venus retrograde will happen that day. The same with, say, the moon suddenly moves over the ascendant. Something very potent and changeable will happen for that person that day. So the ascendant is called the rising sign, or it is also found in what's called the first house. So let's talk about what the first house governs. The first house is the experience of the way your body, your mind or your brain, your physicality was formed. And during the prenatal experience, in the womb is all of that period before you took your first breath, which is the ascendant. So your brain, your body, your character is all forming. And then after the ascendant would be considered your childhood. So that period just before the first breath and to the end of the first house shows the way that your brain, your body, your character, how you view the world, and whatever the ruler of that ascendant is, like, what house are you going to steer the ship for to get all of the experiences that you need to have as a traveler on planet Earth. So let me just stop here for a moment and see, because I'm going to work this out with Lindsay. Does Lindsay understand so far what the ascendant is and where you would find it in whole signs?
I do, and I could just recap it really quick.
Yeah.
So your ascendant is found somewhere in your first house, between 1 to 29 degrees and 59 minutes. Mm-hmm. It's not cut in half, it's always one sign. Mm-hmm. And your ascendant is if we had to choose one thing in your chart to be the most important, is the most important. It's essentially your essence.
Yes, right. So anything else, Lindsay?
No.
Yeah, so the essence, so that's really important. So what we say in astrology is if you know what your rising sign is, your ascendant, or what is your first house, and you do the activities of that sign, then you have vitality. You can breathe. It's good to be on the planet. So it's really important to know what your rising sign is in whole signs, and then say, okay, if I complete this, if I'm always looking to this first house in whatever its sign and the activities of that sign are about, then I'll be able to breathe. I'll be able to function, and it allows the rest of the chart to work. Now, why is this so significant for people who are studying their own charts or working with clients is that clearly everyone is working from a different first house rising sign. So that if you're a Cancer ascendant, like we just showed in this chart example, then it would be the maternal qualities of the moon, the nurturing, the sensitive, to feel with the body is to know, to be able to create home and family, and all of those things that are Cancer, which is a very feminine, motherly approach to things. So in order for that person to even breathe on the planet, that native needs to be able to complete that first house. And if they are somehow not able to share their emotions or tell how they feel, then that native will crawl back into the shell of Cancer, which is the crab, and not be able to breathe, function, or love, or do whatever their work is on the planet. So when you are studying astrology, the most important point on the chart is the ascendant and getting the native to know that. So if you don't study anything else and you just listen to this video, know your sign and degree of the ascendant, because the next piece is that degree, so say it's at 18 degrees 46 minutes, you would look at 19 degrees in the Sabian symbols and also get a basic tarot card reading for what the energy of the chart is also. So that's the next piece, okay? Now after that is the ruler of the ascendant. What house are they operating in? This is the next variation in the life work of everyone on the planet. So we're going to go kind of house by house and tell you what each house is now. And I'm going to add my interpretation, but also the ancient interpretation of what each house means. So the first house, as we said, is the body, the way your body forms, maybe in the womb, the way your brain forms, the way your heart forms. It's your first breath in the first house. It's your character. It's your vitality and vigor, and it's what allows you to unlock the rest of the chart. So the first house is absolutely essential. You must do your first house. Absolutely. If you study nothing else with us, please know your first house. Now the second house is money, because we still have money on the planet, but also resources and what you value and how you would spend your resources. Now, how the houses are configured to the ascendant also tells, is that house a strong house? Meaning, can it be seen by the ascending point of the native? Can it be visible? Now, the second house is a blind spot because it's immediate to the first house. So the second house would be considered what's called a cadent house, or not configured to the ascendant, so that it doesn't earn more vitality and vigor from being viewed from the ascendant. So there are 4 different houses like that in the 12 houses that are in astrology that don't have as much vigor because the ascendant can't see them. And the second house of money or values or resources does not have as much vigor because the first house cannot see it. It is not configured by a geometrical aspect to the second house. So in that way, if your planets are very, by and large, in the second house, it's somewhat harder for the native to breathe if the second house is the area of activity, because it's all about money. And you can see how that would work. Can you see how that would work?
Yeah.
Okay, so then, did you want to say something about that?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So people just watching us for the first time, I've been studying with Lolita for about a year now, so just so you know. So I'm learning as we're talking too, but the second house, I always also thought it had to do with self-worth.
Yes. So,
in addition to values and money.
Yeah, so Lindsay has already done my first astrology course, so this is her second time around, and in the second house interpretation, I would also say that the way you spend your money has to do with your self-worth. So if your self-worth is that I should have big, bright windows and I should have a very, lovely house to live in, maybe Venus is in your second house and she just wants beautiful colors and nice artwork and some good jewelry, that's the way you would find yourself worthy of those resources, of those material goods. So yes, self-worth. Let's put that in the second house too. So let's review again. Money, values, resources, and the way you would spend those resources reflect your self-worth. Okay, good, Lindsay. So in the third house, I'm going to offer what I have always offered about the third house, and I'm going to add the ancient interpretation. The third house is our siblings, because once we're born and we take our first breath, the second house is, do we have enough money and resources to continue to live? The third house is, that's when you meet your siblings. So if you have siblings and have relationship with your siblings, often there will be enough planets there to prove that, to show that you relate to your siblings. And it might be biological siblings, or it could be someone like Lindsay and I, who she feels like a sister. So a sibling in that way also. This is also the house of early education, or what I call study, and communication. So by this age, you have been born, you have resources, and now you're going to communicate. You're going to do short travels around the neighborhood and talk to people. And that was a way that you could study. Now, from the ancient perspective, from astrological texts that are being studied by my teacher, Demetra George, this is also called the house of the goddess. And when you add that, this becomes a very interesting house, because there are no other houses that are attributed to, say, the house of the god or the house of man. This is interesting in astrological texts from ancient times. I'm talking about ancient Greece or ancient Egypt. This is the house of the goddess. So the third house also rules sacred ceremonies, rituals, and all kinds of study of divination or different tools that we used to honor the goddess, which is very interesting. So if you have planets in the third house, or the ruler of your ascendant is in the third house, that's going to be a main focus for you. And the fourth house is, once you have done this early study, you start to really know about your home and your property and be more interested in the land and the investment of where your physical house is. So the fourth house is where my parents live, or my ancestry and origins. It's often a home or a physical house, a building, land, or the property that your house is on. So depending on what planets you have in your fourth house, that will describe the kind of land. Do you want to live in an apartment? Do you want to live in a farmhouse? Do you want to live in a little log cabin with a fireplace? Do you want to live on a boat? I mean, there's all different ways that we would be able to look at the fourth house and say, oh, okay, this person would want this kind of home arrangement. And depending on what sign, which we don't want to complicate things for today, but it would describe the type of home that they live in and what the home environment and family feels like. Now, the fifth house is, once you have your home, your property, and you have somewhere to live, this house then is your creativity. Now you can be creative. Let's have a garden. Let's put in big windows. Let's put on this bedspread. You can be creative. You can dance. You can make art. You can make music. All of those things are in creativity. This fifth house is also the house of sexuality. So sexuality is where we merge together to love one another. If there are a lot of planets there, this is a main focus of that creativity and sexuality. And from that, you get the children, the quote, children of that, which could be artistic children. They could be balms, tinctures. They could be any kind of needlework or crocheting or whatever creative output that you enjoy, or it could be physical children. So if you have many planets in the fifth house, depending on what those planets are, or the ruler of the ascendant is in the fifth house, then the life is steered by your children. Okay? The sixth house is domestic pets. So I'm going to throw that one out there. I'm not often using domestic pets, but because I have a lot of domestic pets and bored dogs, I can say this is true. Okay, so the sixth house has the title of domestic pets, health and healing, or the crises of health and healing, depending on what planets are there, your service to others, or actually the word servitude was given in the ancient text. So your relationship with an employer or someone who was causing you to give service is also in the sixth house. Now, the sixth house is another house that is not configured to the ascendant. It's a 150-degree angle, and it's another kind of blind spot. So if you're like looking over your shoulder to see what car is coming and whether you can merge into the lane or not, it's a blind spot unless you also use your mirrors, because 150 degrees is a blind spot. So the sixth house is considered another cadent house where the energy from the ascendant is not particularly vital. That's why it's the house of illnesses. Okay, also healing from those illnesses or any kind of health crisis. Okay, and the seventh house is once you've done all of this, you have your home, you have your creativity and sexuality, you've healed from all the health, and you have some kind of service in the world. Then the seventh house, which makes an opposition to the ascendant or the first house, is the descendant, so the other person, your relationships, your clients, possibly your partner or your lover or your spouse. All of those persons that would be considered like the mirror image of you are in the seventh house. Okay, I'm just going to keep going quite quickly because there's many things I want to cover today. The eighth house is what we talked about, death and the border crossing between this life and the next life, or the dimensions, because from my perspective, we are all multidimensional, so we are one fractal of self here, but there are many other fractals of self throughout the dimensions. So I often find the eighth house are people who can connect to those other worlds. Now, in modern times, this is also the house of being indebted by money, other people's money. And depending on if you're still really locked down in that system or not, modern astrologers are saying that that is a house of other people's money. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm going to put that out right now because depending on who your clientele are, you may or may not read it like that. And this is a course for you to be masterful in deciding. Take notes on every chart that you have. If that person has the sun or the moon or some main luminary in that eighth house, do they often encounter debt or other people's money, or do they more resonate at the frequency of the mysteries of death, the dimensions, magical realms, and other worlds? So I'm putting both things out right now. The ninth house is distant travel. So the third house is like your little neighborhood travel. The ninth house is like a higher octave. So whenever you're making the oppositions around the chart, it's somehow related to the opposite house. So in the ninth house, instead of your early education, it's your higher learning. This is the house of distant travel, astrologers, seers, the metaphysicians, and often like religious figures, or what we would have called gurus if we still needed masters and leaders to guide us. So that is the ninth house. The 10th house is your public persona. So the fourth house is your home, your family, like your inner world. People may or may not see how you live. The 10th house is your career out there in the world, your vocation. You're a public figure. If you have many planets there, then you tend to have a public type of persona where many people might know you. So this is important to realize, because if you are trying to be a public persona, but you don't have any planets at all in the 10th house, but you have a lot of planets in the 4th house, you must do what your chart says. Okay, so some of you know, if you're watching this video, when I do a chart reading and people want to have like a studio space and they want to have people coming into their studio space and they want, you know, to present some programming from that public position, but I don't see anything in their house. I said, well, what you said you would do is this, but we often get distracted by what other people or the media is presenting as success, meaning having a public persona in the 10th house. Now, the 11th house is your friends, the groups that you're involved in. It's also known as the house of patrons. Now, this is an interesting one. So if you have planets, say you have the ruler of the ascendant in that 11th house, in modern days, you might have a YouTube channel and you need a lot of subscribers in order to somehow make money from your YouTube channel. That's the 11th house. That's patrons from the larger community, possibly the global community. So I'm calling the 11th house friends, groups, patrons, and the larger community. Okay, so in ancient times, it wasn't as if people in New Zealand were going to be having their chart read with me. But today, that's entirely possible. Okay, and then the 12th house is another blind spot, meaning that the first house cannot see the 12th house. It's like if Lindsay was sitting really, really close to me, and she was so close to me that I couldn't like really get a look at her because she's like my Siamese twin. She was right next to me. So the 12th house is another house not very vital, not having a lot of life force because it is not configured to the ascendant by any whole sign aspect. So in that way, we call that the house, or the ancients called that the house of self-undoing, a house of suffering, in which we have things that are hidden from us, things that we must transcend, possibly a form of imprisonment. I have also used that house as those people who work on the collective unconscious. So they're tapped into the psyche, they're working behind the scenes, which is what I would call hidden. They might not have an incredible public persona, but they are working very hard behind the scenes. So let me just give you an example of this. Someone in an institution like an ashram or a prison, which to me is kind of the same thing. It's a place where you must use your spirituality to transcend the imprisonment. So my guru, Maharaji, said that every one of the ashrams was a prison, because he would be there and everyone would be around him and he would have to, give talks or give blessings or feed people or whatever it was. And he called that central jail. And some of the gurus who I have done charts for, so like, for instance, Amritanandamayi Ma, she has most of her planets in the 12th house. And although she's this great spiritual leader, she really has a life of imprisonment where she's put into cars, she's taken to hotels, she's put into a public place, thousands of people come up for a hug, but she has no life of her own. Do you understand that? So in that way, it's a place of transcendence of any of your own selfish type of ideals. And I also have called it kind of the vision quest house, where on a vision quest, you have to go up on the mountain, spend a lot of time alone. Don't bring your food or anything because it's going to be a hardship because you're searching for a vision. So do you understand that 12th house? Okay, so let me just stop here and let Lindsay comment if there's anything that I still need to talk about on what each house stands for.
So there was a couple of thoughts I had, taking it back to the 8th house of dimensions. I also wanted to mention in traditional astrology, they often use that as the house of sexuality. But right?
Mm-hmm. Well, modern astrologers have
or
said
not
that.
traditional, sorry.
Yeah,
modern.
Yeah.
And we really focus on the 5th house
Mm-hmm.
in whole signs and in Lolita's galactic astrology course. And I think that really changes the chart. So I wanted to point that out. And these are all things I learned.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 9th house, another thing that I learned, which is interesting. I've always known it was the house of career.
Mm-hmm.
But
The 10th house is career.
Sorry. See, this is, I hope I'm not confusing everyone.
That's okay.
The 10th house of career. But I wanted, and maybe you can clarify this, the second house is how you make your money,
yes.
right? And the 10th house is the work that you're doing in this life.
Oh,
so it might not actually mean like your professional career. Am I correct?
Yeah. So that's good, Lindsay. This is why Lindsay and I work really well together. So the 10th house may not be how you get resources. The 10th house is, for instance, because I have my chart in my head, I have Black Moon Lilith in the 10th house. Now that doesn't necessarily, I mean, if anyone has something like Black Moon Lilith in the 10th house, your career is restoring the divine feminine. I don't really make money that way. I mean, maybe I could, but the 10th house is what you're doing for the planet. It's kind of your mission or your vocation, okay? Whereas the second house is where I have my Neptune in Scorpio, conjunct Astro Wizard. I make money by doing charts. So Lindsay's saying this correctly. And then I also want to follow up on her 8th house. Modern astrologers in the 1970s, a man from France said that the 8th house had to do with sexuality because every ejaculation was a death for man. And Lindsay and I, when we first did this video series, the question she put forth, well, where does that leave woman? So that doesn't work at all to put sexuality in the 8th house. So please keep that in the 5th house. Okay.
And then finally, in the 12th house of the hidden or collective unconscious, I've been seeing, as I've been doing more and more charts, I believe it's called luminaries, like the sun. If one's sun is in the 12th house, that often, when you were telling the story of the woman guru, that's what I feel when I see that too, is kind of like they can't like fully realize themselves. Is that correct?
Well, let's look at it as an opposition to the 6th house. So another way to think about every one of the houses is somehow like the 1st house makes an opposition to the 7th house. So it's me and the other. Let's look at the 6th house, which is the house of illness or health and healing those illnesses, or service or even servitude, or domestic pets, which you need to go out and feed every single day. So it's a type of like, there's no way I can leave my horses. I need to feed them every single day. When you take that over to the 12th house, a person with the sun in the 12th house, like Amma, Amrita Nandamaima, is feeding people every day, nonstop, thousands of people. She's hugging them. It's almost as if she's has no life of her own. She's in complete service, nonstop, to persons who are in crisis. Often, they're coming up to Amma asking, can you help me with this terrible family situation? Now, in prison, which I had used that example, say you have your sun and your moon in the 12th house, and you find yourself in prison in this lifetime. Now, we haven't discussed karma or anything, but I would say that a life in prison is also a transcendence or a spiritual mastery in a way, because you've given up all your other worldly careers, your home, your family, your children, possibly your creativity, your ability to make money and so forth. You're in prison. But in prison, you can spend a lot of time doing self-reflection and meditation. So in a way, you're completely hidden from the rest of society, but you're still working in the collective unconscious. You're still working in the psyche. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, we still have some time here, so we're gonna jam-pack these videos, and we're gonna give you a lot of videos. So don't feel like you have to, understand everything right now. When I watch my teacher's videos, I watch them at least 3 times. And I take copious notes about everything that she says, and then I'll watch them 3 times several months later because I've changed. So watch these videos often. Now the next piece is I want to just show you the ascendant is the eastern horizon. So whatever's on the descendant describing the other person is the western horizon. The midheaven, which is called the MC, is a place of what's up in the sky. So it's straight up. The earth would be right here. The MC is a place what we could call the north. Now, it's not really true north or magnetic north, but it's up, okay? So in the four directions, this would be the east, the west. This would be kind of the persona that's out there in the public. And the IC, which will be directly opposite the MC, is also a place that is somewhat private. I wouldn't call it hidden, but the IC, one astrologer said that kind of your galactic or your astrological DNA comes from the family origins of the point of the IC. And this would be a completely opposite to the MC, making the four directions in the chart really important. What I've written about the IC, which is called the Imam Coli, is that it's the, quote, bottom of the sky, because the earth would be the center, the very center of this wheel. The point in space where the ecliptic crosses the meridian of the north, or the northern hemisphere. But in the south, in the southern hemisphere, it's completely reversed. So you just always have to put in the place of birth, the exact time of birth, whether it's AM and PM, and the location of birth for every chart reading, because that exact time and the location are crucial to getting the exact degree of the ascendant, the MC, the IC, and the descendant, which describes the other person. So whole signs, exact time, exact place of birth, so that you know the location in what hemisphere you're in order to get the chart correct. Now, I wanted to just show you a couple of charts, and I just pulled some random charts this morning so that we can use examples. So this one I will point to the ascendant is at the beginning of the house. So here it is at the beginning, and it's conjunct Vesta. So the other piece of what's important about an ascendant is that whatever planet it is conjunct, meaning that within a 3-degree orb for this ascendant, possibly as wide as a 7-degree orb, Vesta is the keeper of the mystic flame, which represents the heart of the goddess. So this is like a priestess energy that this person carries. So whatever planet is conjunct the ascendant also is very strong. Now the second piece is that this is Libra. So the planet that rules Libra is Venus. Venus is found in the 3rd house, the house of the goddess. So I pulled this chart just to show you some examples. Vesta conjunct the ascendant, so she already is keeping the mystic heart of the goddess. Venus in the 3rd house is the ruler of the ascendant, so that this person is very much pointed towards doing the work of the goddess. Do you see that, Lindsay?
We do.
Okay, so let's just pull a couple more real quick before we get to the 45-minute. And I don't even know whose charts these are. I draw all my charts because the aspects, I have not found the aspects to be correct in any astrology program. Plus there's a certain magic. So now here's an ascendant at the last, or near the last degrees. This is a 24-degree ascendant in Capricorn. Venus is in the 1st house, so that love and beauty and goddess energy of Venus is there. It's separated by 22 degrees, but it's still there. So whatever planets are in the 1st house are very important. Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. So then we have to say, okay, where is Saturn sitting in this chart such that this person's work is all around? Saturn is conjunct Chiron in the 3rd house of the goddess. So a lot of my clients will have a lot of planets in the 3rd house because they resonate with my energy towards the goddess. Saturn in the 3rd house, communication, study, rituals toward the goddess. And just very quickly before we close down today, This person has Sun in the 12th house, and I know this person. Now I know whose chart this is. So she is very much dedicated to the goddess, and she does a lot of service, and she has a huge center, a center where she works from to serve all people. So she has vision quests and a lot of spiritual mastery and transcendence from that place. All right, Lindsay, we have only a few seconds, so I'm going to stop for now, and we'll be back soon.